Hello and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be covering all of the events, all of the major events from this offensive so far, a month on after the start of the offensive on June 4th, and the whole situation surrounding the whole start of the phase, as well as how it's going so far and how the Ukrainians are planning to continue from here on out and what the countermeasures the Russians still have left. So starting out, we have on June 4th, we start the start of the offensive. So the offensive started on June 4th, where we saw an initial rush of Ukrainian vehicles in two directions, to the south of Velika Novosilka as well as to the south of Orikhiv. Here to the south of Orikhiv, we saw the main push. It was a combination of Western armored vehicles sent to Ukraine. This contingent of vehicles included over 10 Bradley M2A2 infantry fighting vehicles and a combination of multiple Leopard 2A6 tanks. So in the first week following this start of the offensive, as well as the armored tank column going through to the south of Orikhiv in the direction of the Russian defensive lines in the south here in the Zaporizhia front, the Ukrainians lost over 10 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in a single assault, as well as two Leopard 2A6 tanks, and this is known now as the tank graveyard. It took place here to the east of Novodenilivka, going whether it was in the southern direction or eastern direction, I'm not really sure, but most likely in the eastern direction, in the direction of Novopokrovka. But it could also be here in the southern direction, moving through the fields, moving in the direction of Robotine, or even in the direction of Verevove. Either way, the Ukrainians were planning to send this as a testing force to test the capabilities of these vehicles, as well as the Russian defenses. This was a start of a week-long time of probing attacks by the Ukrainian forces as they tried to test out the Russian positions, Russian defenses all throughout the front line, all from Velika Novosilka and throughout the whole Zaporizhia front. So in this period of time, we saw that the Ukrainian forces were using advanced equipment, but at a smaller scale. They weren't doing the main spearhead that we were all expecting, as they had done in the Kharkiv region, as well as the Kherson region, where they gathered a lot of equipment, 30-40 tanks and hundreds of armored fighting vehicles. All of these, they didn't do that. They only gathered small platoons with 10 to 12 armored vehicles, including a couple of tanks. All of this to test out the Russian defenses. And what they saw was the utter destruction of their own reconnaissance groups, as the Russian forces had prepared these defensive lines for over half a year, and it shows that preparing these defenses were definitely not in vain, as Russian forces, with a combined use of heavy artillery, helicopters, air force, and so on, all of these combined together, as well as anti-tank gun missiles, they use all of these weapons to just destroy all of these reconnaissance groups before these reconnaissance groups even came into contact with the Russian lines. So essentially what we saw was that there was a combination of probing attacks all throughout the whole offensive, especially by the Velika Novosilka area, but also here in the area south of Orikhiv. They continuously sent platoon after platoon, but in the end they didn't manage to do much else than test out the Russian response. Then began a 1 week long operation, where they then started going from probing attacks to initial shaping operations, where they, especially in Velika Novosilka, managed to capture village after village. They managed to capture Neskushne, Storosheve, Makarivka and Novodonetsk. Since then, the Russian forces have managed to recapture Novodonetsk, but although the fighting was heavily continuing in this time, this was in late June, the Ukrainian forces continuously pushed to the south of Velika Novosilka, but since the capture of Makarivka, they have been unable to continue onwards, and this forced them to change strategies yet again. They moved from armored columns to a combination of armored vehicles and their own infantry soldiers being sent to support these vehicles. This allowed the Ukrainian forces here in the Velika Novosilka area to capture the villages of Rivnopil, Novodarivka, Levatne, and to continue their pressure on these parts of the front line, capturing the river line here to the north of Priotne. So they are seeing a slow but steady advance on this part of the front line. In comparison, in the other areas south of Oryhiv, we have still yet to see any villages being captured, but the Ukrainian forces have here expanded their zone of control to the south of their own villages, captured a lot of these fields and progressed through them. And this has mainly been because of the switch of tactics, which allowed them to capture these forest lines. If we zoom in, we can see that there's a lot of forest lines. These the Ukrainians could move through using the infantry, which allowed them to capture heaps of territories here to the north of Robotine. However, again, they have yet to pass through all of these minefields. In the direction of Lubkove, the Ukrainian forces managed to capture the village of Lubkove as well as Pyathatki after a lot of fighting. Pyathatki is the village located in a rift, which allowed the Russian forces to heavily bombard it whenever the Ukrainians entered it, which made it very difficult for them to hold on to it. But now they've managed to hold on to it after a lot of fighting. The fighting of Pyathatki had taken multiple weeks just for this small village with barely any houses. This shows that the situation that the Russians were in around Bakhmut is now happening in this part of the front line, which indicates that the Ukrainians are not in control of the battlefield. The Russians are, as they are dictating how the battle is being fought by this battle of attrition, which they are continuing throughout the whole front line. They have prevented any Ukrainian significant push by preparing all of these defenses, especially the minefields, as whenever the Ukrainians use their mine-clearing vehicles, they end up in a situation where the Russian artillery, Russian helicopters and so on destroy the mine-clearing vehicles. There was this video, I'm not going to show it because of YouTube guidelines, but essentially there was a video from early on in the offensive where the Ukrainians sent multiple mine-clearing vehicles, including Leopard 2A force with mine-clearing equipment, and they drove on. After that, the Russian helicopters as well as artillery kept hitting them, which destroyed the mine-clearing vehicles, and then the rest of the vehicles spread around and they ended up getting hit by mines. So essentially, the Ukrainian offensive was completely destroyed, cut off, denied from even happening by the Russian minefields and all of the preparations the Russians had prepared to prevent the Ukrainians from even clearing these mines. And that is when we entered into phase 3. And this is where the Ukrainian forces have changed their strategy from a battle of attrition, from attacking with armored columns and columns with armored vehicles as well as infantry, to then moving on counter battery strikes. The current focus of the Ukrainian army from the third week of the offensive to now is to attack the Russian artillery, attack the Russian aircraft, and prevent them from destroying any further mine-clearing equipment, as the Ukrainians need to prepare a section of the front line, clear all of the mines from that area, and then push onwards. So what is currently happening is that the Ukrainians are trying to prevent the Russians from having the capabilities to destroy all of their mine-clearing vehicles when they eventually launch an assault. The way they're doing this is, of course, hitting the supply lines, which they have continuously been doing, but they have also managed to hit a bridge here between Crimea and Kherson. They've also aimed at the Kerch bridge, but they have so far failed due to Russian air defense. But they've also hit a lot of areas as in Melitopol, Berdyansk and other areas within the southern front to cut the supplies going in and out of the Zaporizhia front line, which would give them an advantage when it comes to resupplying their forces. However, the Russian forces are responding in kind, hitting all of the Ukrainian supply lines as well as their gathering of forces to prevent them from gathering up large size companies of forces, which would prevent them from launching a large spearhead. The second way the Ukrainians are doing this is that they are trying to lure out the Russian Air Force and set up traps by having forward infantry positions with anti-air missile systems, and then launch an armored attack, after which it withdraws as soon as the Russian Air Force reveals itself, after which the infantry will try to hit the Russian Air Force. This has cost multiple helicopters on the front line, as the helicopters generally have a range of 10 kilometers, while the Ukrainian anti-air portable systems have a range of 5 kilometers. So they need to bring them in closer so that the Ukrainians are able to actually shoot down the helicopters. Otherwise, the helicopters would just stay behind the lines to such a point that they can just attack the Ukrainian forces safely without any issue. So the Ukrainians are trying to counter this by putting some quote-unquote pawns to sacrifice them, like in a game of chess where you sacrifice a pawn in exchange for a more useful unit. So the Ukrainian forces are trying to essentially calculate what are the benefits, what are the merits, what are the demerits, to figure out exactly what move to pull, because war is war. You're going to take losses, and sometimes taking out your Russian helicopter is going to cause less casualties, even if the Ukrainians have to sacrifice some in the long run, as the Russian helicopters have especially proven very useful throughout this offensive, as they have completely destroyed multiple columns of Ukrainian armored vehicles as they try to advance throughout the front line. And then the final point is drones. We have seen such an extensive use of drones throughout this offensive, although it is not in the mass swarm some were claiming prior to the offensive, which I always denied because it is logistically impossible. However, we are seeing a lot of drones being used, both on the Russian side with the Lancet drones and the Shahed drones hitting all of the Ukrainian vehicles moving throughout the back of the front line, as well as the howitzers, the self-propelled artillery, and generally all of these anti-air systems that are located in the back line are getting hit by drones. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian drones are also hitting concentration of Russian forces. They're hitting some of their artillery positions, and they're also attacking them in their trenches. So essentially what we're seeing is that there's a lot of back and forth, especially here by the Oryhiv and Velika Novosilka areas. But generally on the front line, the current battle is a battle of attrition, where both sides are trying to cut down the opponent's ability to use their forces effectively and to essentially win the battle through this means, as if the Ukrainians are able to destroy enough of the Russian forces to be able to launch an armored spearhead and clear the minefield, then they'll actually be able to face the Russian forces. But until then, it is an indirect battle, similar to if you check out on my Patreon, I have a archived live stream where I cover the general strategy of Gerasimov, where he essentially advocates for a battle without facing the opponent. And that is exactly what the Russians are doing right here. They are trying to win a battle without even seeing the Ukrainian forces. And this is a continuous strategy throughout the whole war. The Russian forces have always tried to fight without appearing. And that is to the point where some Ukrainian soldiers were saying months after being sent to the front line that they had yet to see a single Russian soldier. So with this use of this strategy, the Russian forces are able to so far hold back the Ukrainian forces after developing the air force, after developing and strengthening the artillery, after preparing all of these defensive lines. And the Ukrainians are so far unable to break through and reach the first line of defense of the Russian forces, which they had prepared for 6 months. So this very long line here is a long trench system, as well as multiple lines of mines ahead of it and multiple lines of anti-tank trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and a lot of other things that are used to prevent any armored advance through this area. So generally this is only the first line. After this there's 4 other lines moving all the way down to Melitopol. So the Russian forces have prepared extensively for this offensive, and so far, although the Ukrainians have only used a fraction, I'm not exactly sure what that fraction is today, At the very first week, it was about 20%, so it could be moved all the way up to 50% today, but I'm not really sure how much they have put into this so far, but it doesn't seem that it is enough as of yet, as they are unable to push further than what they have reached so far. Other than that, the second major event was the Wagner uprising. So suddenly in the 24th of June, the Wagner Prigozhin just announced, oh, we were attacked by Russian forces, we're going to Rostov. They occupied the city of Rostov, then they moved northwards through Voronezh and through Tula, all of these Russian regions, after which they were within 200 to 300 kilometers of Moscow. Then they suddenly stopped, and then they negotiated with Lukashenko, and they negotiated with Putin, of which the result of that negotiation has been made public today. After a leak, the Kremlin announced that on June 29th, Putin met with Prigozhin and the commanders of the Wagner PMC detachments. There were 35 people in total, and they were engaged in debriefing on June 23rd and 24th. At the meeting, Putin assessed the actions of Wagner in the course of the war, and on June 24th, the president listened to the explanations of the commanders and offered them further employment and application of their skills. The commanders themselves presented their version of what happened, and the meeting lasted 3 hours. So essentially, this indicates either one of two things. Either this was just an excuse to relocate the Wagner forces from the Donetsk and Donbass region in general to Belarus, where they're now being located to, or that this was all not planned. Prigozhin had some sort of plan by himself and essentially used this to get to talk to Putin and tell him about his plan. But either way, it doesn't seem that Prigozhin had any intention of overthrowing anything or generally doing anything other than getting into contact with Putin and telling him his mind, or to just pull the attention away from their redeployment to Belarus, having an excuse to go there. But essentially, according to my latest information from Remy Lind, who has personal contacts within Wagner, according to him, essentially the Wagner forces are sending huge columns to Belarus, but this isn't just the Wagner forces. He's saying that it also includes Russian forces. So both the Russians and the Wagner forces are building up their forces in Belarus, and he's claiming it to be very significant. The prior estimate of Wagner forces as to their strength right now seems to be somewhere between 25 and 50,000 soldiers. If this is combined with Russian forces, even to just match it, then it will be between 50 to 100,000 soldiers. That is a huge amount of numbers, especially considering that it is far from the front line. Most forces on both sides are concentrated here in the south, with the combination of the army that is being built up, the reserve army, according to Shoigu, numbering 160,000. This could easily gather up to 200,000 soldiers in Belarus, or generally across the whole front line, across the whole border between Belarus and Ukraine, as well as Russia and Ukraine. So there's generally a lot of possibilities to use with all of these reserve forces. They could also just be used as reserves in the south, and then there's only a gathering of Wagner and Russian forces between 50 and 100,000 in Belarus. But that would still be a significant force that could split up the Ukrainian army and essentially take advantage of their now numerical superiority in comparison to the Ukrainian forces. And those two are what I believe to be the most significant events of the offensive so far. Other than that, there's been continuous attempts by the Ukrainian forces on Bakhmut. We could call this the third significant event, where the Ukrainian forces have completely captured the western parts of the canal and are moving closer and closer to Klishchiivka. Klishchiivka is a very important village for the Russian forces, because the loss of Klishchiivka would essentially mean the loss of the whole southern flank of Bakhmut, which would be devastating for the Russian forces. So the Russian forces are putting a lot of effort into holding it, to the point that which the Ukrainians contested the trench network here to the north of Klishchiivka, and then the Russian forces sent helicopters, sent reinforcements to hold on to it, and they pushed a bit westwards. So that is the current situation in Klishchiivka. The Ukrainian forces are attacking heavily against Klishchiivka, and the Russian forces are responding by sending heavy reinforcements to the area to prevent the loss of the village. As I've mentioned, it is a very important village for the Russian forces and a very significant area to hold on to if the Russian forces wants to defend the Bakhmut southern flank. As for the northern flank, there's also some fighting here, but it is on a much smaller scale than in the southern flank, as the Ukrainian forces are seeing a lot of success here in comparison, and this is mainly due to the height advantage they have from attacking from this direction, as the only area the field is leveled is by the trench network. Other than that, the rest of the areas, the Ukrainian forces have the high advantage in this area, especially after capturing the western trench network of Klishchiivka right here. The Ukrainian forces have managed to capture this, which allowed them to push further, capturing the surrounding areas, and have the high ground here in the southern parts. And that are the three major events so far throughout this whole offensive, and what we have seen throughout this last month, actually a month and 6 days of the offensive. And so far we're seeing a very limited success by the Ukrainian forces. It is hard to call it a success considering only the capture of 8 villages throughout a month and 6 days, while still having difficulties capturing actually important settlements like Klishchiivka, as well as the villages of Staromelnivka, as well as the village of Vasilivka. The Ukrainian forces have so far not managed to close into these villages. They've managed to capture some of these villages closer to their main positions, but they have essentially just evened out the battlefront over here at the cost of heavy losses. And I'm not saying this to be biased to one side or the other. Generally, the attacking forces having difficulties in comparison to the defensive forces, especially when the defenses have prepared for a long time. This is also true for the Russian forces when they were attacking through Bakhmut and generally in the Donbas region. The Ukrainian forces have prepared defenses for a very long time, which gave them a huge advantage. But the Russian forces also have an advantage when it comes to firepower, when it comes to air superiority, and many other factors which all play in. So when the Russians are on the defensive, their advantage is significantly higher than what the Ukrainians were when they were on the defensive. And that is all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.